It's my pleasure to introduce today's seminar speaker. So, an Israeli born in 1949, Nurit Khaled El-Hanan is a university lecturer, a professor of language and education at the Hebrew University. Her latest publication, titled Palestine and Israeli Schoolbooks, Ideology and Propaganda in Education, was published by MitoPoesis in the UK. The book draws attention to an education in Israeli schools that appears to lean towards racism rather than tolerance and diversity.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, as you see, this is based on my study, really, about Palestine in Israeli school books, in which I examined school books from after the Oslo Agreement until 2013, no, even before. I mean, 13 is after the book, but it's still going on, about the representation of Palestinians in Israeli school books. It's a multimodal analysis, namely an analysis that takes into consideration the whole page, the verbal part and the visual part, and the relationships between them. Altogether, I studied 5 geography school books, 20 history school books, and 5 civic studies school books. I just want to say that in Israel, school books are trade books. It's a private industry, but they have to be authorized by the ministry, and we'll see later on what basis. I just want to start with this quote from Achilles Membe, a philosopher, who said in his very known book, Necropolitics, Contemporary Forms of Subjugation of Life to the Power of Death, that the most proficient execution of necropower is the contemporary colonial occupation in Palestine. And that means really that Israel is a success, because every year 18-year-old boys and girls are recruited to go on with and carry on this policy, and as we know, there is very little resistance. So from this point of view, education is a great success. So my question was really based on a question that Frantz Fanon asked once. He asked, how do the oppressive people behave? And I asked, how do the oppressive people educate their children? Now, part of this education is, of course, textbooks. It's not the whole of education. There's a lot of other aspects to education, but they're all recruited to the same mission. School books really, as you see here, are meant to legitimate the state and reproduce national narrative, create a usable past for the future citizens, much more than relate accurate facts. This we know from many studies about school books, including in this country. Israeli school books are meant to inculcate the Zionist collective memory to both Jewish and Arab students and reproduce the Jewish national territorial identity. I'll just say in parentheses that Arab students in Israel study from the same books as the Jewish ones, so they study about the Zionist project and so on and so forth. They don't study their own culture and history or poetry or literature until they go to university. The State of Israel never had peace education officially, formally. There are a lot of initiatives, but it was never part of the curriculum, it was never encouraged, and it was never carried any academic credit, and so on. So I can really say it is discouraged. In schools, for example, nobody is allowed to use there's a series of joint history books of Palestinians and Israelis. They are forbidden. I mean, nobody can use them. So peace education is really discouraged. Something interesting is that, for example, last year, the slogan of Ministry of Education was, "The other is me." And that was a slogan for tolerance and so on. But when in Israel you say the other, you mean the secular Jew and the religious Jew. Palestinians are not the other. They are not anything. Israel, as we know it, cannot be called a democracy, of course, and I borrow the Oren Iftahel's term of ethnocracy. And as in other ethnocratic states, it really reinforces the narrative of the dominant ethno-national group while silencing, degrading, ridiculing, and so on, contesting cultures of perspective, which means in Israel the Palestinian one. Now, as I said before, the books are trade books. Anyone can write a book, a textbook, but it has to be authorized by the Ministry of Education. And they have to be authorized if it has, the books are authorized if they have a few basic assumptions which are given as givens, not to be discussed. So the first sort of such basic assumptions are existential, assumptions about what exists. So we all have to teach children there is anti-Semitism all over the world, Arab hatred and threat, Jewish historical rights on the land of Israel and Palestine, of course. Israel Arabs flight from the land. They abandoned the villages, they refused the partition plan, and fought Israelis to perdition. I mean, they brought it upon themselves. Propositional assumption, what can or will be the case, Palestinian citizens constitute a demographic problem which can become a demographic threat. One book, Eli Bar-Levi, calls it a demographic nightmare. If it's not controlled, Palestinians in the occupied territories are a constant threat and must be controlled. Value assumptions. What is good and desirable, Jewish state, Jewish majority, and Israeli control. These are the prime principles and ideals of education. Therefore, we can say that all Palestinians are seen as Philistines. It's another quote from Membe. Bloodthirsty, war-mongering terrorists, and since time began. I mean, the whole Palestinian society, everyone, past, present, future, are the enemy. This sort of nationalism, of course, breeds racism, as we see from, everybody knows that, Balibar, Fanon, Vodak, who come from different fields, but it, of course, very clear that colonialism and nationalism, sexism, ethnicism, all these breed racism. This racism is what is called today cultural differential racism. It's not biological. It's not because they have a long nose or a certain color, but because they are Palestinians. It's a racialization of a group. And of course, it invades all aspects of life, culture and economy and education, the press, and so on. How do the books cope with it? Because I don't know if you know much about Israeli education, but it's very advanced education based on humanistic values and Jewish values, liberalism, democracy, and so on. So how do you cope with it when you have to teach that as well? There are some ways. I'll show you examples. For example, in this book of civic studies by Avram Diskin, it's presented as if there's no contradiction, as you see here, okay? There's no contradiction between the fact that Israel is comprised of a civil nation of citizens and the fact that several ethno-cultural minorities live in it, but the only nation that enjoys self-determination is the Jewish one. So they tell you there's no contradiction, and this is it. Now, Palestinians in Israel live under what is called state of exception, which is a situation that happens sometimes in war when a state conquers some areas and the conquered population is not subjected to the law or domination of the conquerors, but usually it's very short. It should be very short. In Israel, this state of exception has lasted for 68 years already, okay? And really it is, as Giorgio Agamben said, producing legally a human being juridically unable to defend himself. I don't know if you know, but Palestinians cannot go to any court anywhere in the world, okay? They are discriminated, if they are citizens, the citizens are discriminated by law. For example, they cannot buy land, they cannot expand by law. All civil functions in the occupied territories are transferred to the army, especially the power to issue decrees with the force of law. And this is not an anarchy, but on the contrary, it is a situation outside the law, within the law. And the Supreme Court sanctions it all the time. What do the school books do with that? They present Palestinian state of exception as normative, their discrimination as citizen and total lack of social and human rights as their lot, their fault, and a necessity for Israeli security, which is the divine force in Israel. If you say security, everything goes. For example, here is another civic studies book. The Arab population is defined as native minority. They have been transformed into a minority following their painful defeat in the War of Independence, and that explains the difficulty in accepting their minority status. Also, Zionist ideas and Israel's definition as the state of the Jewish people make it hard for Israel's Arab to accept their minority status. Okay, so too bad for them, but this is the situation. That's the way. And I don't know if you can see there. Linguistically, this kind of assertion doesn't leave you any room for discussion. Some other quotes. The Palestinian attempt to make Israel the sole responsible for the results of the war lack any moral basis. When you do go to war, you cannot lament your defeat. The Arabs brought it upon themselves, for they fought the Jews to perdition. And here I'll say something in parentheses. Palestinians are never called Palestinians. Not in the public discourse and not in school books. They are called Arabs or Israel's Arabs in order not to give them the name they call themselves and the right to define themselves as a separate entity from the Arab world. Okay? And what the children learn is that they have 22 other countries they can go to. Why did they come to us? So this is on purpose. When you say Palestinian, it always coupled with terror, not with the people. Here is another example of discrimination that is soothed off, like the Arab Student Association helps Arab students in petty daily problems such as housing, scholarships, loans, and employment. Of course, it's not petty because they don't get housing, scholarships, loans, and employment. Okay, this is one of the main problems of students, and one of the ways university, for example, don't let them housing, don't let them live in the dorms, is the priority that we have in all institutions of Israel to army veterans. So by the time these people come to the dorms, it's occupied. Or what we call naturalization. I mean, this is it. This is by nature. It's a natural fact. For example, part of the Bedouin population dwells in 45 settlements unrecognized by the authorities. Therefore, they do not receive any services and so on. But there's no discussion about why are they not recognized. Okay? Of course, the children don't know what unrecognized villages are because they are not shown, they are not told. This is an unrecognized village, for example, at Tyre, that was destroyed I don't know how many times this year. Okay, this is an unrecognized village, and this is what happens to it every week or so by the authorities. I don't know if you know about the racist law of citizenship of Israel, but this also has to be justified for the children. So this is what this book says. The law denies citizenship on Palestinians who live in Judea and Samaria or Gaza and who marry Israeli citizens. So what happens really in reality is that they cannot live together. They cannot live together either in the territories or in Jerusalem, for example. If one of the pair is from East Jerusalem and another from Hebron, they cannot live together. Their children don't have any schools to go to, and there are lots of problems arising from that. So this is the law. It is given in the book. Some defend the law in the name of Israel's defensive democracy and Israel's right to eliminate the danger of terror. Some commend the law for national reasons and the need to prevent Palestinian immigration and keep the Jewish character of the state, which means demography. The Supreme Court ruled that this law is unconstitutional, but rejected the petition against it because it was an emergency law. And by the way, all the Israelis' laws are emergency laws, so they can get away with it. And this is an example to show you that the Supreme Court is accomplice. A military government, you know that all Palestinians in the occupied territories live under military government. Everything goes to a military court and so on. they don't have any civil rights. And the book says it's a good thing. And also, until 67, maybe more, the Palestinian citizens within Israel lived under military government. So the book says it's good because it helps Jewish settlement all over the country and prevents Arab seizure of vacant land. Now, vacant lands are usually the lands that were confiscated from the Palestinians along the years. This is the result of being controlled by the military. Okay, this girl is now in prison because she was court-martialed. She was judged in a military court to prison. She's been there for 2 months already, and nobody can do anything because the civic authorities or institutions cannot interfere. They said that she threw a stone, but of course the children don't know it. Now, Israel is defined in the books as a defensive democracy, which is a variation on, I think, Germany's offensive democracy. And the children learn that this is a good thing to do because you can be a democracy. Democracy does not mean national suicide. That's something that Supreme Court Barak said, said once, and it's quoted in all the books. Okay, you can be democratic, but there's a limit to it. And so they tell them about checkpoints and administrative detention and so on. But this is the only picture that I found of a checkpoint. And as you see, it's a very empty spot in the middle of nowhere with some, I don't know, soldiers or police chatting and drinking coffee. So the message to the children is that to do checkpoints is not that bad. I mean, nobody's there. It's just formality and so on. Now, I don't know if you see on the side, but it's very light. It's very lovely. Here you see a bunch of children very happy in their defensive democracy. This is Owl explaining about administrative detention. And here we have something, I don't have time for that, but here under the checkpoint we have the story of Mordecai Vanunu. And I don't know if you know the story, but it's very interesting to see the relations between the checkpoint and the Vanunu. And Vanunu is equated to this monkey who doesn't know what button to press. But everything is very light and lovely. Okay, so we do checkpoint, we do this, we do that. And the children don't know, the students don't know what is really happening in checkpoints. And then they have these questions: what is the purpose of the checkpoint? How does it serve our defensive democracy? The owl said this and that, and so on. Advantage, disadvantage of administrative detention. It's all very theoretical and very light. Of course, they don't see these pictures of checkpoints. This is daily routine. Every morning you see that, or this. And this is the meaning, for example, of administrative detention. They can take any child they want for any length of time without telling anybody and without having him seen his parents or a lawyer or anything. This is administrative detention. But the children don't know about it. The only example that I found about administrative detention in books is a funny story about a rabbi in Jerusalem. You know that in Jerusalem, the ultra-Orthodox, if you pass their neighborhood with a car, they stone you. Or if you pass the neighborhood, I don't know, not dressed properly and so on. So one rabbi one time was detained administratively, and then he was exiled to another city. So this is the only example that you have in the books about administrative detention. You have nothing about the Palestinians, of course. Now, school books are multimodal texts. They are comprised, as I said, of verbal and visual chunks. And so we can read it as we read multimodal text, first by, of course, by the picture, and then we go to the verbal text. If you look at this axe, which is the first one that you see, right? Where is it? Here, this, right? We see here very idealistic Bolshevik sort of farmers, and here we see a guard who looks exactly like an Arab. And the title of this double spread is Land of Israel, Types. Now, when you speak about types of a country, you don't speak about people who came 3 years ago. You speak about indigenous. But the idea, and the Zionist idea, was to indigenize themselves. And they tell you here that they came about 2 or 3 years before the pictures were taken. Already they look like the indigenous population. If you see this one, especially, he's very suntanned. Where is he? Here. He's suntanned, he's muscly, and he's mustering an Arab horse, and he has a gun. This was the Jewish dream of diaspora, yeah, to be a Jew with muscles, a Jew with color, a Jew that can ride a horse and shoot a gun. So this is the first axe, right? This is the other axe. Those 2 windows, they speak about the Arabs. Now, I should say that in none of the books, and there are hundreds and hundreds of books, including books that are called the Arab Population or things like that, you cannot find one photograph of an Arab person who looks like us. Nothing. There was one book that was banned, and there I found one picture of a Palestinian girl. But you don't find even one photograph of Palestinians in any book in Israel, any textbook. So these 2 windows, they speak about the Arabs. And for me, my reading, here it's a piece of a speech of Yitzhak Epstein, who was a Zionist leader. He talked in the Zionist Congress of 1907. And he said, if Zionism doesn't respect what he called the masters of the land, the Arabs, it would short-live. Okay, it wouldn't survive. And he called it a missing question. And here you can have the answer of the missing question. They tell you about the increase of population, Jewish and Arab, until 1939. But here, in the extreme left, which in semiotics is called the newest part of the message, they tell us that by 48, the land would be emptied of its Arabs, of most of its Arabs. So we can say that this is a question, here is the answer, don't worry. All right? And this is the main message. Now, my reading is that it's a very colonialist message, but there are other readings as well. For example, Ruth Führer, who studied textbook, this is what she says. They have open, optimistic faces, well-built, suntanned. This is the Zionist ideal. As is the young guard who rides a noble black horse dressed in modern clothes with an Arab kafia and a kal on his head and so on, for athletic, suntanned, all the ideas, healthy and optimistic of diaspora Jews. But she doesn't trace the colonialist undertone. This is one example of what you can do with layout. The title of the chapter is Palestinians from Refugees to a Nation. But the first thing we see, of course, is this photograph. This photograph is very known in Israel. Usually when I'm abroad, I ask people, what do you think it is, relating to the title? What do you think it is? The Palestinians from Refugees to a Nation. So what can be the photograph? Usually people say we can see Palestinians running away from an attack. But as I told you, there's no picture of Palestinians in the book. Least of all, suffering Palestinians. These are people running away from Palestinian so-called terrorist attack, which was not very clear that it was a terrorist attack. But anyway, this is what the children get first. And when they come and read this part, Palestinians from Refugee to a Nation, the message is clear. We don't care. Refugees, nation for us. They are terrorists, okay? Also, the opening says that the chapter would explore the development of the Palestinian problem and the different opinions in the Israeli public about the problem and its solution. So I don't have to make equations here, but I'm sure you make it for yourself. Okay, the use of racist discourse. All the books really very systematically respond to strategies of verbal and visual racist discourse, first of all by excluding Palestinians. We don't see them where they can live, depict them as agents of actions which are held in low esteem, subservient, deviant, criminal, or evil. They are always talked about as homogeneous group with negative cultural connotation and racial stereotypes. Let's see example. They are always represented stereotypically as threats and problems. These are the problems that are held against Palestinians in Israeli discourse and education. Refugee problem, Asiatic backwardness, demographic problem, and security threat. For example, the Arab society is traditional, objects changes by its nature, reluctant to adopt novelties. Modernization seems dangerous to them. They are unwilling to give anything up for the general good, which means they are unwilling to give more and more land, but we should know that. In the Jewish sector, there's no objection to allocate some of the private lands for public building. In the Arab section, there's expectation that all public services and needs be provided from the land reservoir of the state. And as I said, the land reservoir are the lands that were confiscated from them. So everything they build is illegal because they never get a permit. Ever since the State of Israel was established, there hasn't been issued one permit for building to any Arab municipality or individual. Never. So everything they build is illegal. That's why you hear all the time about all these demolishing houses, because... And of course, this is what they tell the children. They don't want to pay, and they evade license, so they are outlaws. They are thieves. Palestinian Authority steals water from Israel in Ramallah. They are treated as foreign workers, as you see, whose wages are lower than the real citizen. But don't worry, this is characteristic of all developed countries, so we are in good place. All the others are Arabs. We don't really care who they are, what they are. So as you see here, all the groups are called Arabs. And also, they are treated impersonally, meaning with no semantic features of human as a problem. Yeah, the Jews were defined as the Jewish problem in Europe, and today the Palestinians are defined as Palestinian problem. For example, this Palestinian problem matured in the poverty, the inaction, the frustration that were the lot of the refugees in the pitiful camps against what we call naturalization. That's their lot, nothing to do. This is the Palestinian problem. As you see, it's kind of environmental problem. No people, just terrible poverty and whatever you make of it. It's a poisonous problem, as you see. The Palestinian problem would poison for more than a generation the relationship of Israel with Arab world and with the international community. This is Barnaby again, who says that annexing the West Bank would be a disaster for Israel and would shatter the Zionist dream. I believe you can read it. I don't have to read it. Yeah. Right? And he equates it to South African nightmare. Now, this was written after the victory of Mandela. And again, there's something in Israel called mitzpim. They are community villages or, I don't know, settlements on top of mountains in the Galilee overlooking Palestinian villages. And the reason given in this geography book is to prevent a territorial sequence of non-Jewish settlements, and fear an Arab sequence would cause detachment of Galilee from the state of Israel. And here they speak about Arab citizens. I mean, the purpose is not to let them acquire land. Let's see how they are shown visually. This is one way to show them, which means not to show them, okay? This is Jabalia Camp in Gaza, no people. Theo van Leeuwen, who is a semiotician, writes about a similar thing in Dutch books, but it fits here very well. He said it's the angle of the pilot who flies too high to be able to see people on whom he's dropping the bomb. And this is the kind of knowledge education is still primarily concerned to reproduce, okay? This is Jabalia, that's how it looks to the pilot who has to bomb it up. Of course, the children, and this is what they say about about the camp. The population is growing fast, the rate of unemployment is high, houses are crowded, poor, standard of health services, education, and hygiene is low, with no what we call human agency, nobody's fault. This is the way it is. Of course, nobody sees these pictures from Gaza. If I mean, if you go down with a camera, you would have seen these things which education is not interested to show. This is very recent. So how are they shown? Children are shown only as terrorists, as you see here, as refugees, as primitive farmers, what is called the Oxfam image. Okay, and you see the heading of this double spread, from traditional to modern way of life in the non-Jewish population. Non-Jewish meaning primitive, poor, so on. Okay, Van Leeuwen said that this picture figures in a dictionary of racist icons that was published in Holland. And this book, Geography of the Land of Israel, wherever they speak about any Arabs at all, they show you this racist icon. Now, we all know that no Arab in the world looks like that, I think. I mean, with such pants and pointed shoes and all. It's kind of a model of Alibaba conceived by European painters or drawers of the 19th century, but they use it in order to speak about the citizens of Israel. Yes, and of course they refuse to live in high buildings and so on. Here is his wife. This is interesting because this is geographical spread of Arab settlements in Israel. And as you see, the Arabs themselves are placed in Jordan. And this is all the more interesting because on the other side of the page, we see this. Okay, Jewish newcomers who step right into the West Bank, okay, the land of Israel all over Gaza, and the brave plains all over the Golan Heights. This is a pyramid of Jews and Arab population. As you see, the top group is Jews and others. Nobody tells the children who the others are, so they assume they are non-Jews who are not Arabs, which is true. And at the bottom, you have the Arab population, again with the racist icons of the camel and this. And this is interesting because here Israel features as the last one of this line of developed countries, thanks to a little asterisk that said Israeli data refers only to the Jewish population. It was accepted by Human Development Report as all right. Cartography. Cartography is very interesting. Of course, it is, as Henriksen says, verifying power, reinforcing the status quo, freezing social interaction, and so on. And as Professor Bagal said, the border of Israel represented on the map represent the right-wing ideological perception. I mean, nobody in Israel or Palestine know where the borders are. Nobody. There's no map that shows the international borders, even if you go to banks or wherever. Okay, so this is one example. This is Israel. And as Bagal said, these maps are lying. I mean, all the maps are lying, but they're lying. And one device is really what is called to have toponomic silences on the maps. What does that mean? I'll show you. Here, for example, you have Arab population in the state of Israel. You cannot see it, but there is not even one Arab city mentioned. Not even Nazareth or Acre or no Arab city. I mean, all the cities that are mentioned are Jewish cities. And in the middle, you see this. The legend says an area for which there are no data. I mean, we don't know if there are people there or not. Maybe not. Okay? Jerusalem. Against, this is the Arabic side, you see? And as you see in this side, we have no government, cultural administration or national site. Nothing, it's empty. So this is the strategy of excluding them. And the educational message is that international decisions and laws are inapplicable to us. Okay? Mental maps are very, very important because we all live, like Baudrillard said, by the map. No, we don't even know what the territory is. This is an example. factors that inhibit the development of Arab village. Arab villages are far from the centers. The road to them are difficult. They have remained out of the process of change and development. They are hardly exposed to modern life, and there are difficulties to connect them to the electricity and network. You would think we're talking about Australia, right? But we are talking about this. This is a map issued by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Israel to show the world the narrow wasteland of Israel, how narrow we are and threatened. So all these remote villages are somewhere here, which is at the most 50 kilometers. Okay, those remote villages where electricity and water cannot reach. Another strategy is really to reify or to legitimize the conquest and the occupation by biblical phrases in the geography school book. So here you have, the title is One Sea with Many Names. You would think we should have the, I don't know, the Phoenician names, the Lebanese name, the French names, the Italian names of the Mediterranean. Instead, you have all kinds of phrases from the Bible that tell the children how God promised them the whole place from Iraq to Sudan, I don't know. Okay, this is the title, and thou shalt spread abroad and so on, and they explained it in case the children did not understand. Interpretation, in future your country will expand to the west and so on and so forth, in case you haven't gotten it. So we can conclude that Israeli narrative is underpinned by the idea that the state has a divine right to exist, violence, sovereignty, in this case, claim a divine foundation, and everything is recruited to that. All right? This is again from Achilles' member. The last topic I want to talk about is how the schools teach the students to legitimate massacres, which is very important because the same techniques that legitimate past massacres were used in the last two attacks, for example, on Gaza, the very same ones, and they really learned that. Not all massacres need legitimation because some of them were effected according to plan, or at least openly according to plan, or with the tacit consent of Ben Gurion. I don't know if you know the story about Lid and Ramla, when Rabin asked him, what are we going to do, kill them all? And Ben Gurion did something like that, okay? And that was interpreted as... Now, when do we need justification and legitimation? I was talking before about creation of a usable past. We have to create a usable past for the children to live their future by, okay? To legitimate the founding crimes of the nation. These three are still debated in Israel, okay? The Yassin massacre, Kibbeh massacre, and Kfar Kasem massacre. All the victims are presented, as Zizek said, object whose pain is neutralized, okay? They tell you between 100 and 240 were killed, or more than 40, or a few dozens. They never give you the number. I mean, it's like you talk about cattle. A main type of legitimation is what we call MitoPoesis, which is like a mythological narrative. Oedipus killed his father, but he saved the city. Okay, so the killing itself is not justified, but its outcome is. So posteriori, the massacre is legitimated, okay? It's not condoned, but it's legitimated. For example, Deir Yassin, the slaughter of friendly Palestinians brought about the flight of other Palestinians, which enabled the establishment of a coherent Jewish state. Of the books say that. Kibbeh massacre, I don't know if you know about the Kibbeh massacre, Ariel Sharon, 53, slaughter of Palestinians in their homes brought about some confidence to Jews in their homes and restored the morale and dignity to the army. So posteriori, it gives you the reason, right? And a lot of books. And again, I'll quote from Membe, who says, one's horror at the sight of death turns into satisfaction when it is someone else who is dead. We know that. Each enemy killed makes the survivor feel more secure. That's why they say it made them feel more secure, or somewhat secure. I asked once Eyal Naveh, who is a very distinguished history professor, and he writes books, and he's on the left side. I said, how could you write somewhat more confident? How can you say that about the massacre? But he has to say that in order to be authorized. Kafar Qasim, soldiers were ordered to kill, the curfew hour was changed, and the soldiers were ordered to kill whoever was not at home by curfew, and of course, nobody knew about it, so one officer decided to obey the order, the others didn't, and within an hour they killed about 50 people, children and women and so on. So how do the books deal with that? They say a barbaric crime brought about an enlightened verdict, because the judge said you should not obey a manifestly unlawful order, and this is a term that was coined during the Nuremberg trials versus Nazis. So this was very brave, okay? And others say that this slaughter, which was enabled by the military government and its permanent situation of curfew, was the starting point of a process that ended 10 years later with the abolition of this same military. So it was for the best. Legitimating effect relying on highest authority. For example, the escapes of the Arabs, enhanced by the massacre of Deir Yassin, solved a terrifying demographic problem, and even a moderate person such as the first president Weizmann spoke about it as miracle. So we end the chapter with this miracle. And the children, of course, biblical norms of eye for eye and kill whosoever sets out to kill you, which we call deterrence, is very encouraged in education in Israel, if you see these questions, okay? And do you think these reprisals were enough to deter the Arabs? Okay, 50 Egyptian, 40, how do you think it influenced the morale? Sometimes, not many times, very few times, they do give explanations to why the people were killed, but these explanations are, better not be there, because this is exactly what we had in Gaza a few months ago, right? The loudspeaker encouraging the inhabitants of Deir Yassin to leave the village did not work. The people did not leave, and that's why they were killed, okay? Same we found in Gaza. We told them to leave. Or the soldiers did not know the people were hiding in their homes that night, okay? You cannot know. And another thing they do, after they describe the massacre, which is a very brave educational act, they hail the killers, okay? They hail the killers. For example, the notorious unit of Arik Sharon, 101 unit, excelled in their audacity. They were endowed with extraordinary courage, improvisation, perseverance, tenacity, loyalty to wounded friends, and so on and so forth. So the idea is that such wonderful people could not have done an unjustified wrong. And if they did that wrong, they had a good reason. Okay? And of course, always with iconic photographs and poems or songs, which, in Barth's term, create a myth. Okay, here after, this is Deir Yassin. This is the report about Deir Yassin. I'll just show you here. And here we see our brave and beautiful soldiers on the rubbles of a very nearby village that was according to plan. Okay, look how beautiful they are and erect and clean. Here is a very, very known song about comradeship, about these soldiers. And here is the road to Jerusalem, which this and other massacres helped to open. Or this, here is Ariel Sharon with other notables after the massacre of Kibia, and again you have a song that hails their courage and so on and so forth. Or this poster, okay, growth against siege. You see the lurking Arab. So, and they are the answer. And here, only here you have the massacre. So what is the claim of reports about massacre? Positive outcome for us may condone, overlook evil done to them. And empathy is race, religion, ethnicity related. Students learn to legitimate massacres by transcending the individual incident and considering long-term consequences from a Zionist military point of view. So they really learn the language of generals and politicians that they will have to use. All this education produces what is called a literacism. The racism that comes from above, from government, from papers, from education. And this is done by the racialization of Palestinians, okay? They are seen as Philistines, and as Theo Goldberg said in his book about racism, no limit to terror or torture, death or destruction, incarceration and interrogation, so long as they service the security of the chosen people. So maybe they are bad, but we must do it. It's a lesser evil. And I leave you with that. Okay, I think this is this is the end of it. So I can take questions now. Yeah?
I have two questions. I was wondering, are these textbooks used in East Jerusalem as well?
No, no. In East Jerusalem, they use the textbooks of the Palestinian Authority, censored by the Israeli Ministry of Education, which is responsible for them. So the children get books with blank spaces. Every page you have blank spaces, okay? Wherever there is the word Palestine or nation or I don't know what, they just erase it. So this is very interesting, you know, because the children really know something's going on here. But East Jerusalem is half and half. It's half Palestinian Authority and half, yeah.
But Nurit, my question for you is about the difference between the textbooks used in the more religious schools and the less, because you see this a lot in popular discourse, either in journalism or policy, that the problem, yes, there is a problem with Israeli textbooks and their racism toward the Palestinians, but really it's a problem which is kind of concentrated within religious schools and religious texts, and that, you know, and the kind of piggybacking on a kind of discourse of tolerant secularism here, there's this idea that there's this other Israel which is good and blah, 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 blah.
The examples I brought are from mainstream schools, secular schools, because they are the mainstream and the majority. But you have state religious schools and state secular schools. They learn the same things. What happens in the independent education of the ultra-Orthodox is different. But there it's very interesting, because for them the enemy is not the Arabs at all. It's the secular Israelis. And they are very explicit about it. How we conquered Arad from the seculars. Yeah, it's very funny. But yeah, they even say Peres should be murdered like Rabin. But they are different and they are apart. And they fight. And the Arabs are sort of, you know, overarching enemy, you know, from Bible times or so on. But the real war is against secular Jews. But I'm not talking about these. I'm talking about mainstream, secular state schools.
Thank you very much.